So in chapter 3, we learned the different tools or elements artists use to create artworks. So these elements are our kind of visual vocabulary for talking about artwork. For chapter 4, you're going to learn how artists use these different elements, kind of the building blocks for creating artwork. And these are basic principles or rules of design that artists use to kind of start off creating their artwork, and viewers can use to help understand artwork. In two-dimensional artwork, this organization of these elements is known as the composition, a broader term that can apply to all visual arts as design. Here are the 7 principles of design that we're going to talk about today. And these help us not only understand how artists work, but also how design affects us. The organization of an artwork is one of the most important tasks an artist faces. Pop artist Roy Lichtenstein was quoted as saying, "Organized perception is what art is all about." So the first element is unity and variety. These two elements are complementary. And so this principle uses both unity and variety to balance out a piece. Unity is basically the appearance or condition of oneness. The first principle we're going to look at is unity and variety. Unity and variety are complementary to each other. Unity is the appearance or condition of oneness. There are very few works of art that are completely unified, where everything is completely the same. This piece here by Tony Smith, Die, from 1962, is pretty close to being completely unified. All sides are exactly the same in every way. And so this might not be quite as interesting as an artwork would be if it had a little bit more variety, a little bit more interest to it, so everything's not exactly the same. And how you do that is by creating variety. And so variety is a little bit more diversity added to this unity. It's a counter to unity. And so too much sameness can be a little boring. Too much unity can be a little boring. But too much diversity could seem out of control or chaotic. And so variety has to be balanced also. And so most artists are trying to strive for a balance between these two. Here's a great example of a balance of unity and variety in Jacob's Lawrence's Coming Home. And so as you see here, we have the unity of the seats coming down from the train. There's these windows that come across the train, and then it's kind of divided into these equal bands at the bottom and the top, kind of framing these seats on the train. But then we also have variety because we have the different people sitting in the seats, the different shapes. Even something as subtle as the blinds of the windows being pulled down at different locations adds some variety. And we have unity by this hot, bright red that's being used throughout this piece that kind of guides our eye all the way around the entire painting. And so even though at first glance this painting might not seem very sophisticated, we can see here in the breakdown that kind of sums up what I was just talking about, that Lawrence actually was doing a lot of studying on unity and variety to make this piece feel balanced and easy for the eye to look at. Another way to create balance between unity and variety is the use of pattern. Pattern is basically the repetitive ordering of design elements. And so here the patterns of the floor tiles and windows play off against the larger rectangles of the map, the fireplace, and the ceiling, kind of unifying this entire structure or composition of the painting. The picture plane, the outside edge of the picture plane, actually forms another rectangle and is the largest rectangle to tie everything together. And then the shapes and the figures sitting around the table actually relate to the painting above the fireplace, the same kind of figure and color and shape. And so we see that balance and unity created there. And here we see a breakdown of the diagram of this painting. And so we can see even more of this repetition of these rectangles, even within the kind of backbone or outline of the painting that we might necessarily see right away when just glancing at this painting. Here is another example. So we saw that first piece, a die that almost seemed too unified to be interesting. And now we see this assemblage by Rauschenberg, and he wanted to try to duplicate this randomness of modern life. But this is a great example of how even if you're trying to be completely random, have complete chaos or complete variety, there's always going to be this unity or this sense of order that's created, that we create as humans when we're picking things even at random. And so we see these repeated rectangles all throughout this piece of it's basically just found objects put together to create this sculpture. We see these repetitive rectangles, and then we also see these repetitive, these really dark black shapes that kind of repeat and create this sense of unity and order in this piece that's supposed to be completely disordered. And so it's very difficult to create something that's completely unified or completely varied. And so artists typically try to find a balance between the two. The next element is balance. And balance is the achievement of equilibrium within a painting or design or composition or sculpture. And so basically acting influences are held in check by opposing forces. And so one way to create balance is symmetrical balance. And this is used a lot in architecture. This is a very formal balance. And so symmetry is where both sides of your design look pretty much exactly the same or are exactly the same. And so it's used a lot in architecture because it can make these large buildings seem possible to take all in with a glance, and because you know both sides are the exact same. And so they're also used symbolically. Symmetrical balance is kind of connotes permanence and poise, and so we use this a lot in really important buildings, such here as the White House, where we want these important buildings to be very motionless and stable. And so sometimes symmetrical balance can be a little boring or less interesting. It can have, almost too much unity because we know what to expect from side to side. There are a few works that are perfectly symmetrical, and this is one of them, Posterity, The Holy Place by Damien Hirst. And so even though it's symmetrical and we might just glance and think, oh, stained glass window, what makes it very interesting is the medium that the artist used. This form is entirely made out of butterflies, and it is perfectly symmetrical on every level. Each butterfly is perfectly symmetrical, each unit of the composition is symmetrical, and then this entire work as a whole is completely symmetrical. So the opposite of symmetrical balance is asymmetrical balance, and this is basically where the left and right sides are not the same. Instead, we use other elements and other rules almost we can start off with to make this feel balanced. So basically we have these dramatic imbalances that we can hold in check in a few different ways. Here is the painting of the story in the Bible when Mary Magdalene went to Jesus' empty tomb and then she saw him risen. And so the artist is actually trying to depict two scenes in this one piece. And so he wants to try to make the two scenes seem balanced, not that one's more important than the other. And so first, in the center of the composition has this really strong weight with the dress that is worn by Mary Magdalene, this really warm red dress. But it actually anchors this sky above, which actually isn't quite as large as the dress. And so warm colors balance out cool colors. So we have this heaviness of the dress that balances out this entire sky. Jesus is balanced by the higher massive tomb and the two small figures in red, which are up on the left-hand side. And so two small forms can actually balance a large form. And so how does this work? You can read about it in a few rules on page 73 of your art book. And it kind of goes through these different rules. And a couple more examples are: a form gathers more weight when it nears the edge of a composition, and so it can balance out a larger figure or object near the center of a composition. Intense colors are a lot heavier or have more weight than more dull colors. And so artists use these rules to kind of figure out a good starting point to creating a balanced artwork, even though it's an asymmetrical piece. The truth is, you can start off with these rules and they're great to learn, to be able to discuss and know a good starting point, but artists rely on their highly developed sensitivity to what looks right to arrive at a balanced artwork. And so art is truly balanced when it feels balanced. All these rules are just a starting point. This painting here by Poussin, the Holy Family on the Steps, combines both symmetrical and asymmetrical elements. Symmetrical are the figures. We have this very stable symmetrical pyramid that is created by the figures, and triangles are typically very balanced and stable. And we also have asymmetrical balance, which is in the color balance. We have Joseph, which is in this deep shadow, and the bright yellow robe on the left is Saint Elizabeth. And then the clouds counterbalance these bright blue sky, and these bright clouds counterbalance these bright colors on the left-hand side of Saint Elizabeth and baby John the Baptist. And then also we have this foot of Joseph on the right, and his walking stick are in this very small but very crisp, bright area of light. And so that balances all the light on the left-hand side of the painting and brings our eye back to the right side of the painting to create a completely balanced piece. Here's another painting that's asymmetrically balanced. It's extremely asymmetrically balanced. So when we first look at the piece on the left here, where it's full color, we might not feel that this piece is balanced, but as we see the breakdown in the diagram on the right, we see how our eye is guided to the left-hand side of the painting. And so our attention is first goes to this pole that seems very close to us, this very center pole right here. And then next it goes to this horse, because it is the biggest horse and it seems the closest to us. And then our eye jumps, as we can see here in this diagram, to the next jockey because of his bright red cap. And then we jump to the next jockey because he has that hot pink jacket on. And also this size change, this drastic size change of these horses becoming smaller, makes it seem that they're receding off into the distance. And so our eye pops to the left, and then it pops all the way up to the top where we see this bright, crisp sun and this very dull sky. And so even though this is an asymmetrical painting, it is very balanced because our eye, everything is bringing our eye to the left. And we will learn a little bit more about how that happens as we learn more about the elements. And so as we look at artwork, we will become more and more sensitive to our visual cues and figure out what is balanced and what is not. And then of course we have actual structural balance. And so sculpture and architecture needs to be physically balanced. Obviously we don't want our buildings to fall or our sculptures to fall when they're faced with weather or earthquakes, and so we have to consider structural balance when creating artwork also. The next element is emphasis and subordination. Basically, artists use emphasis to draw our attention to a certain area. What's very important about the painting could be a certain spot or figure, and this is called the focal point, and we know this because of its position or intensity of color or size, so on. There's many different ways an artist can emphasize something in a painting. Through subordination, an artist creates neutral area of space on the composition that may not be as interesting, and it doesn't distract us from this area of emphasis, so our eye just kind of glides across that area but is not distracted by it. As we see and we look again at Poussin's The Holy Family on the Steps, we can see some areas of emphasis. So we already know we have this balanced triangle, but at the top of this triangle we see Jesus as a baby, and he is very brightly lit, and also the architecture frames his head, almost creating a halo. And so we know that that is the most important figure in this piece because of emphasis. And then we have areas of subordination, such as Joseph being in a duller color on the right, and on the top left, the architecture and the plant life being much more duller. And so we know that's not an important aspect of the composition. We know that Jesus is the most important because he is the most emphasized. Directional forces are basically paths for our eyes to follow. They can be actual or implied. And so remember when we just looked at Degas's piece, we saw how our eyes were guided to the left, and those are directional forces. And so how the horses get smaller, and how we see these bright pops of color that guide our eyes to the left and all the way up. Those are implied directional forces that we see. An actual directional force would be this pole. Our eye goes up and down this pole, and that's a very direct, actual directional force for our eye to follow. Here's a print by Francisco Goya, Bullfight. And when we first glance at this piece, it may not feel very symmetrical or very balanced, but it is because, well, for one, it feels balanced. Remember that it feels balanced is how we know it's balanced, but we can use these rules to be able to talk about it. And so here is one of the breakdowns. There's a few more breakdowns in your textbook, but as you can see, we have a lot of directional forces pulling us down to the right hand side, even though there's a lot going on in the composition on the left hand side. And so the bull is his head and his nose and his front hooves are all pointing down to this point on the right side of the painting, and the stick that the bullfighter is balancing on is pointing down to that same spot, as well as the bullfighter's glance is pointing down. And then also you'll notice we have this large diagonal line from left to right created by the bull's hind legs and the bullfighter, and that, accompanied with the bullfighter's gaze down to the right-hand shadow of the bull, creates a balanced triangle, much like we saw in Poussin's painting. And so the artist is using all of these implied directional forces to balance out this piece when there's so much going on in the left-hand side. Next, we have the principle of contrast. Contrast is the juxtaposition of strongly dissimilar elements. And so it's these elements that are basically opposites of one another being placed beside each other, dark and light, thick and thin, hard and soft. And so we see in this luster painted bowl, we see the gold and blue, which are complementary colors. And then we see these different petals that go around. Every other petal has both the blue and the gold in them, and they're basically the same exact petal being repeated over and over again, creating unity or pattern. And then in between those petals are petals with different patterns, and it's only using the gold. And so that's a contrast, and it helps create variety in this piece. Rhythm and repetition gives compositions unity and flow and emphasis, and so this element can be very important, such as when we looked at the interior of the Dutch house, and this was organized by the repetition of those rectangles over and over again. And so here we have the pianist. This is a Cubist piece, and we'll learn about Cubism in the second half of the semester. But as you see in the center of this piece here, we can see the musician's shirt. And then as we go down to the right, it's repeated and becomes music pages and guides us all the way down to this keyboard. We also see these organic figures of the pianist's face, and as we go down to the right, we see them repeated in these gray figures. And so this repetition creates this rhythm where we view the painting from the upper left to the bottom right. And then we also see this hand here, and it has this repetition of these shapes of hands. And so it's almost like how you can think of an old cartoon where it would just repeat the same thing over and over again, kind of to create motion, where it looked like it was moving. And so that's what the artist is doing here to make it look like he's playing the piano. And so he's using this repetition to create movement and look like he's playing the piano. We also have repetition here. We have this very, very flat background, and we have the repetition of these birds, and they almost look like they're traveling across this background because we have this rhythm of these legs where they're kind of placed a little differently at different angles, and so it looks like they're walking across the composition. And then we also have the beaks where they're placed at different angles, kind of breaking up this repetition where it looks like they're almost coming to life and moving. And so in this piece, we also have this repetition. We have these similar diagonal figures all grouped together, and then we also have the diagonals of their hats and brims, their bayonets, and their swords. And so we have this feeling of moving forward, this feeling of taking action, and this painting actually became symbolic for the determination of the oppressed people during this revolt. And so we really want to have this sense of taking action and moving forward. The last element we will talk about is scale and proportion. Scale is size in relation to one thing to another, and proportion is the size relationship to parts of a whole. And so in this diagram here, you can see how scale and proportion changes. This circle in the center of these flower-like figures stay the exact same size, but on the left it becomes smaller because the circles around it are bigger, and on the right it's vice versa, it becomes more large because the circles around it become smaller. And so a lot of artists can use size distortion in a humorous way. For example, these two artists created shuttlecocks, and this was on the lawn outside of the Kansas City, Missouri Museum of Art. And so, you know, the game Shuttlecocks uses these figures here, but they're much smaller. Obviously, these there are 4 shuttlecocks that are spread throughout this yard of this museum, and they each weigh 5,000 pounds and are around 7 foot tall. And so these artists are kind of mocking this kind of stoic idea of the facade or the architecture of this museum by having these large, humorous shuttlecocks kind of looking like they're floating all throughout the yard. So an artist can use these 7 principles in many different ways, and but their main goal is trying to create this very balanced, harmonious piece that's pleasing for the eye to look at. Here we can see a record of a process for an artist creating a painting. So these are different sketches. There's even more for this one painting, but this is an example of some of the different ways an artist can go around changing how the elements are used to create a balanced and harmonious piece. And so here is the finished piece that Henri Matisse has come up with here, large reclining nude. And so as you can see, the warm and cool colors balance each other out. There's the repetition of the squares. There's the repetition of the shapes of the legs and the arms. And so even though this is a very seemingly simple piece, this artist has gone to great lengths to make sure to use all of the elements and principles to make this balanced piece for us to look at. And so now, knowing about the different elements and principles, we have this vocabulary we can use to discuss the artwork we'll look at for the rest of the semester. In the next chapter, we'll actually learn how to use this vocabulary to evaluate artwork in 3 different ways. And so it's very important for you to take note of these different terminologies that we used in these 2 chapters, and to be sure to practice them and be able to use them throughout the semester.